I am at Northwestern, which is just outside Chicago. I live a few blocks from the Chicago city line. I've been here for 20 years, and I work on the intersection between religion and U.S. foreign policy and global politics, and trying to rethink some of the categories and assumptions that particularly U.S. and European policymakers bring to the table. And in this particular talk, I'll be focusing on the politics of abortion and how I think we can get past the fear of religion and the sense that religion and religious people are always a threat to abortion politics and the politics of the right to abortion in particular. So I'm going to talk about that today, and I'll welcome all of your questions. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. It looks like I'm going to have to allow Zoom, have to turn it on. So one moment, bear with me.
Should have permissions. Okay, there you go.
Okay, good. I'm glad you can now see it. Let me just open the slideshow feature. And you should be able to, hold on one. There we are. How is that?
That's great.
That's great. Okay, good. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, very helpfully, Emily's already given you the summary of the talk, which is what I wrote here. Wasn't sure if everyone would be on the same page where we're starting. So what we're talking about here is public opinion and specifically a very major divide that structures the abortion rights debate in the United States between religious and secular. The understanding that religious people are against abortion rights and secular people are for them. And I think that if we move beyond this divide, like in so many areas of public policy and public life, it opens new spaces for us to explore alternative forms of solidarity and alternative ways of understanding community, understanding care for each other, and care for the earth as well. So let me begin with the Dobbs decision, which you're probably familiar with. I will just give a very brief summary of it. So in the U.S. Supreme Court Dobbs decision, which came down on June 24th of last year, the court overturned the constitutional right to abortion in the United States in a 6-3 ruling. Writing for the majority, Justice Alito stated that procuring an abortion is not a fundamental constitutional right because such a right has no basis in the Constitution's text or in our nation's history. He wrote that in order for a right to be protected by the Constitution, it has to be either explicitly spelled out in the text or, this is his words, deeply rooted in our history and tradition. A joint dissent from this opinion, the dissenting opinion, was authored by Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. And they argued, as you can imagine, the court has stripped women of all rights, destroying lives, curtailing women's status as free and equal citizens, and negatively impacting women of color and women with limited means. This decision sent shockwaves across the country. One of these firestorms involved liberal indignation over the threat that this decision posed to the separation of church and state. The decision ignited fears among liberals and progressives of the fall of the wall between religion and state. To give an example of this perspective, in Politico in August of 2022, Kimberly Bailey published a piece called "The Supreme Court Wants to End the Separation of Church and State." This is a very common way of framing this decision. She argued, quote, "The Dobbs decision marks a serious step in an emerging legal campaign by religious conservatives on the court to undermine the concept of separation of church and state and to promote Christianity as an intrinsic proponent of democratic government," end quote. The author assumes here that there is a rigid separation in place and that this represents what she calls a bedrock concept. Yet the wall of separation is in fact a complex and contested metaphor. When those who favor abortion rights try to defend access to abortion by trying to keep religion out, they are assuming a lot about religion. They assume that if religion were separated or cordoned off from public life, then democracy, equality, and women's health would flourish. I think we need to look more closely at this story, not to dismiss it entirely, but to engage it carefully. First, it obscures the fact that the majority of Americans, whether religious or secular, actually support access to safe abortion. The problem then is not simply that religious people are against abortion rights and secular people are in favor. It's just not that simple. A 2019 Pew Research Center survey found that 61% of Americans in fact say abortion should be legal in all or most circumstances. More than half of American Catholics favor legal abortion. The vast majority of U.S. Catholic women use contraceptives despite the church's official ban. 56% of U.S. Catholics believe abortion should be legal in all or most circumstances, whether or not they believe they personally would seek one. 1 in 4 Americans who've had abortions are Catholic, according to the Guttmacher Institute. So in other words, it's clear that the terms religious or Catholic or Christian do not necessarily translate into anti-abortion. So second, and this is a kind of more conceptual side to sort of more brain candy to think with, the claim of a wall of separation that allegedly insulates public policy on the one hand from religious affairs on the other has a very particular kind of disciplining effect on public conversations on these topics. Specifically, it empowers the state to decide what counts as religious. So the wall between church and state can only be built after the state has decided where religion begins and ends. But, and I think this is a very big but, this is just simply not what we have in the United States. We have disestablishment. The government does not decide what is or is not religious. Religion is legally disestablished. The state officially and formally has no authority over the religious domain. But how can that be true if the state is also deciding what is and is not religion? So you can see the incoherence of the wall metaphor and the contradictions and paradoxes built into this are very clear when we start to think about the lived realities of American disestablishment. So let's think then, what is the fear that motivates this kind of yard sign that you see here, calling for building this wall? What are the anxieties that are pressing so many Americans to argue in favor of this wall, and particularly Americans who feel that the Dobbs decision is a threat to their health and to American public conceptions of democracy and freedom? So calls for the separation of church and state historically arise, we have learned from scholars, when elite Americans worry that Americans are not being religious in the right way. They're being either too religious, not religious in a way that is American, or insufficiently private with their religiosity. So they're kind of exhibiting some sort of un-American forms of religion that make people anxious. The Politico article that I mentioned is an example of this. The author thinks that the court has been hijacked by Christian theocrats who want to establish public Christianity as the law of the land. If we calm down a bit, though, I think, and pull back from the anxiety here, it is clear that since the founding of the United States, the U.S. has had a soft, white Protestant establishment. This is not new. We've always been a Protestant majoritarian country. It is built into our laws and institutions, our public culture, our public life, and our educational system, our marriage conventions, the way we understand gender. It goes on and on, the list goes on and on. So what we see historically is that these anxious calls for a wall, build this wall that you see here, they tend to correlate with fears of specific religious authorities, which is also what we saw in the Politico piece. A fear of Catholic establishment. And this is nothing new either. Fears of Catholics and the Catholic Church, according to law professor Philip Hamburger, is in fact one of the main arguments that was used in order to try to justify the separation of church and state. And the metaphor of separation, Hamburger argues, is itself an anti-Catholic move. He challenges our conventional wisdom. He says the separation of church and state has no historical foundation in the First Amendment. He shows that 18th century Americans almost never invoked this principle. And although Thomas Jefferson and others retrospectively claimed that the First Amendment separated church and state, in fact, separation only became part of constitutional law in the U.S. much later. So in short, the takeaway from that book is that separation became a constitutional freedom largely through fear and prejudice against Catholics. Thomas Jefferson himself supported separation out of hostility to the Federalist clergy of New England, nativist Protestants. So here we're talking about the 19th century know-nothings, 20th century members of the KKK, for example. They all adopted the principle of separation to restrict the role of Catholics in public life. Gradually, these Protestants who were arguing for separation were joined by a range of theologically liberal, anti-Christian secularists who were hoping that separation would limit Christianity and all other distinct religions. So eventually we had a wide range of men and women calling for separation, and almost all of them feared ecclesiastical authority, particularly the Catholic Church. In response to those fears, they started to perceive religious liberty as requiring a separation of church and state. So American religious liberty got redefined and transformed, and as Hamburger concludes, the First Amendment was used as an instrument of intolerance and discrimination. So that's an interesting historical rereading of this call for separation. There are a range of other scholars working in different fields who are also investigating the limits of this metaphor of separation, examining contests over the meaning of non-sectarian education, public funding for parochial schools, and the teaching of the Bible as literature. And all of these areas are really gray areas where it's very difficult to separate what we call religion from culture, from politics, from sociality. And I think that it's important to not allow the kind of far right in the United States to define what we mean when we talk about religion. So all these calls for taming religion, for keeping it out, particularly non-Protestant and non-white religions, this is all a part of American history, but they have especially pernicious effects around the politics of abortion. So we will have to work around these anxieties to build a successful pro-abortion rights coalition. And there really is no single view for or against abortion that could be called religious. You will hear other people making other claims, but in fact it is actually just much more complicated. So this is just the Hamburger book that I was talking about. It's called Separation of Church and State, and you can see here Stanley Katz is was a very eminent scholar at Princeton, even the president, explains that Hamburger's laid to rest the history of the credentials of the Jeffersonian myth of the wall and shown how this notion of separation gained acceptance due to the pervasiveness of anti-Catholicism. So he destroys the notion that we have the union of church and state or the separation. As you probably know, in all of your countries that you come from, the United States is no different. There is always very complex interweavings of political and religious histories, institutions, traditions, ways of dressing, ways of eating, ways of conducting our family relations, our public holidays. All of these things are of a piece, meaning they're all together in one package. And the idea that we're either going to have a perfect union of church and state or a perfect separation are equally kind of naive, polar alternatives, neither of which reflects the realities of politics. So hopefully this helps you to start to see that gray area in between those two alternatives. So an example relating to this slide now turning to the politics of abortion rights, in the era before Roe v. Wade, before the decision that legalized abortion in 1973, there was a network of Protestant clergy who worked together with Jewish colleagues to help women who needed abortions to secure them through a group called the Clergy Consultation Service. And by 1973, they had roughly 1,400 clergy members across the country helping hundreds of thousands of women. Today, their successor, as you'll see in the poster here, the lady in the middle, is called Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. So there is no consensus on the abortion question among American Muslims either. In a recent article in The Conversation, Professor Samira Mehta noted that some Muslims believe abortion is never permitted, while many allow it until ensoulment, which is usually placed around 120 days gestation, around 18 weeks. Professor Mehta explains that many Muslim leaders permit abortion to save the life of the mother, since classical Islamic law sees legal personhood as beginning at birth. Mehta also notes that Jewish tradition has a great deal of debate about, similarly, when ensoulment occurs. Various rabbinic texts place it at or even before conception. Many place it at birth, but ensoulment is not as crucial as the legal status of the fetus under Jewish law. So generally, under Jewish law, the fetus is not considered to be a person. In the Talmud, the main source of Jewish law, it refers to the fetus as part of the mother's body. The biblical book of Exodus notes that if a pregnant woman is attacked and then miscarries, the attacker owes a fine but is not guilty of murder. So Jewish law protects the fetus as a potential person but does not view it as holding the same full personhood as the mother. Jewish clergy tend to agree that abortion is not only permitted but actually mandated to save the life of the mother, because potential life must be sacrificed to save existing life. We can also consider Buddhist views on abortion. Buddhists have varied views. The Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice explains that Buddhism, like other religions of the world, faces the fact that abortion may sometimes be the best decision and a truly moral choice. That does not mean there's nothing troubling about it, but it means that Buddhists may understand that reproductive decisions are part of the moral complexity of life. Mehta explains that Japanese Buddhism can be seen as offering a middle way between pro-choice and pro-life positions. While many Buddhists see life as beginning at conception, abortion is common and addressed through rituals involving Jesus, who you see here. These images and statues are popular in Japan, and they console beings who are awaiting rebirth as well as travelers, so they're often seen along roadside paths or street corners. And these bodhisattvas are believed to take care of aborted and miscarried fetuses as well. So the Buddhist approach to abortion emphasizes a complex moral decision that should always be made with an eye toward compassion. So what can it mean, and this is what's been motivating my work for many years, to separate church and state, given the variety and the diversity of these traditions that we've just been talking about? Are we talking now about separating synagogue and state, mosque and state, bodhisattva and state? What about traditions with more diffuse forms of authority, such as Hinduism, for example? And if we want to stick to the church, which church exactly are we separating from? As you know, in the American history, we were separating from the Church of England. But clearly, the Church of England is no longer the same church that we separated from. It continues to transform itself, as do all religious institutions over time. And in the US, with disestablishment, we have an endless array of churches by law. Anyone can establish a church. And so when we say, who are we separating church from state, it's a very, very open question and a very difficult one to answer, perhaps more difficult than it seems at first glance. And in addition, we have to ask, as I mentioned, how can the government be in charge of making this determination when we legally disestablish and cannot define church, state, or religion? So in a sense, when it comes to religion, the United States has no church, quite intentionally. So what does this mean for moving forward on abortion rights and the questions, the vexing questions, the moral quandaries that accompany this debate? Perhaps that the call, we can say the call to separate church and state is a distraction. It's a distraction from the real work that lies ahead for those of us who want to support compassion, women's health, and legal access to safe medical care. We need collective visions and philosophies of life and care that protect and provide for the most vulnerable members of our communities, and these visions will be both secular and religious. They will have to look both within and beyond religious traditions and religious laws. So where could we turn? One place we can turn is to the experiences of medical experts who are actually in the rooms with women facing these very difficult moral quandaries. There was a fascinating interview in the New Yorker, it was last summer, with Louise Perkins King, who's a surgeon and a bioethicist. And she said that practitioners are forced to wrestle with these ethical challenges that come up in very tough cases. And in essence, and this is really the takeaway point, it doesn't matter what the law says. She says when you're sitting in front of someone who may be dying and you're being told it might be illegal to help them, that's not a moment when you can rely on the law to give you guidance. So we really need to find other sources that we can rely on for guidance. And I've mentioned some of the traditions that we have present here in the United States. And I think that part of the challenge is to know how to begin to have the difficult conversations about these issues. So when it comes to climate crisis, for example, impending environmental catastrophes have prompted new forms of collaboration and conversation and deliberation between secular and religious folks about what we owe to each other, what we owe to the planet, and what we owe our descendants, those who will come after us. There was an interesting piece in Open Democracy about the religious aspects of the Extinction Rebellion protests. Some of those are pictured here. And they ask, what would it mean to evoke religious categories as a new way to understand and engage with this climate emergency? To consider the meaning of God as collectivity or oneness, political action as worship, and the space of protest and debate as one of sanctuary. So here you can see there's no wall of separation. It's a different understanding of what it means to bring spirituality, community, collectivity, and morality into a public debate that is just simply not concerned with this idea of the need to separate. So in this article in Open Democracy, the author points out that the rituals that he was part of and that he describes were not enacted as something that was taking place on the side or apart from the main protest. These people were all together in one big protest of people from all different backgrounds. And he actually went and interviewed one parish priest and Christian Climate Action member there who said that the ecological crisis is also a spiritual crisis. Certainly, it seems to be a crisis that requires and justifies spiritual responses and resources, a coalition of religion, ritual, and rebellion. And that's the end of the quote from the priest. So perhaps we could conclude that in the context of abortion regulations, we also need to discuss shared vulnerabilities and uncertainties with the same sense of urgency that these folks are discussing the problem of the climate crisis, the climate disaster, climate catastrophe, climate change, and the kind of pressing need to come together and rather than building more walls, to take down the walls and try to understand how to work together as a collective. To wrap up, as you know, I'm sure the U.S. is a nation of many, many different philosophies and religions. We don't have a single American church. We were built on the backs of enslaved and indigenous peoples all of whom also have their own rich ways of being in community that have oftentimes been combined with in complex, hybrid, syncretic religious traditions with Catholicism, to create new forms of communing with gods, of being religious, being American, being with nature, and being with the land. And we need to always keep these traditions in mind as well in these conversations. And I think this requires that we reconsider the notion that spiritualities and religious traditions have no place in collective life. As supporters of reproductive health care, we might stand with Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Indigenous, and other communities that share our concerns, anxieties, and fears. We can stand with the undocumented student in Chicago who sees different ways of caring for the planet as strengths to build on rather than weaknesses to be exploited by a small portion of the population that is bent on division and domination. All right, thank you so much. I have put my contact info up here. I welcome anyone to get in touch. I encourage you all to get in touch if you would like to follow up on email for some reason, but I also look forward to your questions and comments and conversation, keeping in mind that I do work in a transnational, global perspective, so I'm happy to talk about debates and questions beyond the United States and beyond this particular set of political quandaries that we find ourselves in today here. So look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. And that was really a fascinating kind of unpicking of a lot that is taken for granted and assumed as fact about particularly separation of church and state and what that means. So I really, that's something that I've learned as well from your talk. I'm sure there are quite a few questions. Maybe we can start with Kalpana, and could you please introduce yourself and your media organization when you do speak? Thanks.
Thank you so much. This really was a fascinating presentation. I learned so much. I didn't know about this history. My name is Kalpana Jain, and I'm one of the editors at The Conversation, editing the Ethics and Religion desk. I saw you quoted one of our pieces. That was great. So my question is related to, because I think a key part of everything that's going on is, of course, the Supreme Court, from where it's all emerged. And the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, these days is being talked about as a theocracy by itself. So, could you talk a little about that, about the changes, about the conservative bend of the Supreme Court, and how, it's come to influence so much, just so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. And it's great to have the conversation represented in the group here. It's a rich resource for so many of us and such a great outlet for sharing information among colleagues who many of us are academics, as you know, but we often don't have a chance to publish in more popular venues. So Samira's piece was just so helpful to me, so I appreciate all the work you're doing at the conversation. In terms of the court, yeah, we have got ourselves into a real pickle, as we say in the US, as far as the court goes. And part of the reason is that we have given so much authority and vested so much of our institutional and collective energy into the court. We rely on the court to make these decisions that are going to change all of these people's lives in these dramatic and sometimes heart-wrenching ways. So I think part of the problem is that we need to move away, and this is something that law professors who watch court watchers have been arguing, that we have simply gotten too much institutional weight invested in the court. We need to move away from the court. We need to have more power in our legislative institutions. We need to have much more efforts to get people to vote, to be engaged in civic life, in public life, whether it's at the local, at the state, or at the federal level. And we need to have much more vibrant kind of legislative branch that will serve as a more effective counterweight to the court and be able to actually go and pass laws that then the court is obliged to follow, to interpret, to enforce. As it stands, as you know, we have a legislative branch that is in a semi or quasi-permanent gridlock due to the political polarization that we've seen in the United States that's become particularly pronounced since the Trump presidency, but is not exclusively a part of it. It predated the Trump presidency as well. So as easy as it is to try to scapegoat President Trump for everything, and as much antipathy as I personally have toward him, the reality is that we've had polarization in our system for a long time that has been causing a gridlock. So in a way, I feel like the system itself needs to be reformed on a macro level, and that the court needs to be put in its place. We need to have legislation that is passed that reflects the will of the people. And going back to that slide where I showed you the Pew survey finding 61% of Americans of all different traditions, religious and secular, supporting abortion rights in many circumstances, not just in the life of the mother, but beyond that. There are so many health circumstances and so on that require it. If we think about that, it's clear that the American people are calling for something that the court is not giving them. And that, at the most profound fundamental level, setting aside the fears of, Christian and especially Catholic theocracy, setting it all aside, we're not getting representative democracy. And that should be first and foremost what we're focused on, is institutional reform of the three branches to ensure that the court is actually reflecting the will of the people. And we know what went on with the shenanigans with the election. It's been just a mess, a distraction, and tremendous difficulties in terms of ensuring that the majority opinions are respected and are heard. And instead we're getting arguably an unrepresentative democracy, an unrepresentative president who was appointing people to the court, and this gets back to the problem, who do not actually represent the majority of Americans' opinions on these really difficult and complex moral issues of our day. So that is just to say, it's easy to yell about the court and be mad at the court, and it's also, I think, kind of futile because they're there and we're stuck with them. But what we're not stuck with is our legislators, and we can elect new legislators who can pass new laws, who can make the court much more confined and constrained to the will of the majority.
Thank you for that. And I would like to mention, so we did go to Pew Research Center yesterday, and we did have a presentation on the abortion research that they've done in the United States, religion and abortion. I'd love that you drew out this aspect of, maybe that the Trump presidency maybe drew attention to inequities and problems within our structural system, and your proposal for reform in the three branches. Are you also, do you think that is it the Electoral College as a key aspect of that? And could you talk a little bit to the group about that, and how that might shift representation?
Yeah, so the Electoral College is a bit of a relic of the past, and there have been actually some of the most interesting scholarship on the Electoral College is telling us today that it was really created as a means of keeping slavery in place and ensuring the domination of slave states, just the way the population distribution was working out. The Electoral College is an outdated relic, and it definitely needs to be reformed. It's one of the institutions that is kind of leading us down a sort of predetermined path. Political scientists talk about path dependency a lot, so that you get stuck institutionally in a particular set of routines and institutional parameters that don't allow you to move outside of particular sets of possibilities. That is what the Electoral College is doing. It is institutionally predetermining certain kinds of outcomes that are by their very nature undemocratic, and that is because of the population distribution, which has really exacerbated the inequalities that are reproduced in terms of democratic representation by the Electoral College. Because we have big urban centers, we have a lot of the states that are Democratic have much larger populations, and they simply don't have the same kind of electoral power in their system that arguably they should have in a more perfect representative democracy.
Thank you. I saw a lot of hands up. Dulfo, please
Hi,
introduce yourself too.
Hi Beth, I'm Dulfo I'm an editor from the Philippine News Agency in Manila. Thank you very much for your presentation. We talk a lot about the conservative pivot, particularly the Roe versus Wade overturning. Now, what does this mean for the rest of the world, particularly in Asia, in terms of international policies?
Are you specifically thinking of American foreign policy?
Yes, specifically the overturning, for example, of the Roe versus Wade. How
Yeah.
does this affect the rest of the world?
No, this is what's interesting, and it goes back to way back in the 1990s when I started my work in this area. I actually wrote my senior thesis at Wesleyan up in Connecticut, up the street from you, about what is called the Mexico City policy, which is the policy that forbids the United States government from funding any organizations that even mention abortion or reproductive care for women.